It was a sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was vibrant, alive with the sounds of children playing, joggers rhythmically pounding the trail, and families sprawling beneath the shade of large oak trees. Amidst the activity, a black woman sat on a bench near the lake, a thick book resting on her lap. Her name was Camille, a respected lawyer, enjoying a rare moment to escape her demanding routine. She was immersed in her reading when the screech of tires made her look up. A police car pulled up abruptly, drawing the attention of the few people present. Two officers emerged, their stern expressions radiating authority. Their eyes immediately fixed on Camille, the only person sitting alone in the area. "Ma'am, can we speak with you for a moment?" one of the officers asked, his voice laced with suspicion rather than concern. Camille looked up, maintaining her composure. "Of course." She closed her book slowly, signaling her willingness to listen. The second officer stepped forward, his tone more incisive. "We received a report of suspicious activity here. Can you tell us what you're doing?" he asked, with a coldness that didn't match the lightness of the surroundings. Camille raised an eyebrow, confused. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She held up the book, as if it were proof of her innocent presence. But the officers didn't seem convinced. "Can you show us some identification?" the first officer requested, a demand in his voice. Camille's pulse quickened slightly, but she remained serene. "I don't understand. What's the reason for this?" she asked. "It's procedure," the second officer replied, but his answer seemed unconvincing. The small crowd that had begun to gather began to murmur. Some watched curiously, others exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the rising tension. Camille sighed and calmly reached for her purse, retrieving her driver's license. She handed it to the officer, who examined it with exaggerated focus. "Camille Johnson," the officer read aloud, almost with a mocking tone. "What's your purpose here, Miss Johnson?" Camille took a deep breath, trying to maintain her patience. "I live in this town. I came to the park just to enjoy the day. Is that a problem?" The officer made a curt gesture and returned the license to Camille, but instead of leaving, both remained, asking questions that resembled an interrogation more than a simple approach. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one of them asked with a cynical smile. "Are you alone or waiting for someone?" the other questioned, his hand resting on his belt in a movement that seemed deliberately intimidating. Camille, accustomed to handling tense situations in court, perceived the power imbalance in the air. The officer's tone was laden with distrust, something she recognized well. However, she didn't hesitate. "I'm not answering any more questions until you tell me what I'm being accused of," she stated firmly. Her refusal seemed to trigger something in the officers. The first one stepped forward, his voice becoming harsher. "Don't get smart with us," he said. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not breaking any rules just by sitting in a public park." But what seemed like a simple procedure turned into something far more tense. The first officer, without any plausible justification, reached for Camille's arm. "You're resisting," he said, although Camille hadn't moved an inch. She flinched. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice now laced with surprise and indignation. Murmurs rose as a woman in the crowd began filming on her phone. Camille saw her reflection in the car windows as she was led to the police vehicle, her wrists tightening in the already uncomfortable cuffs. The police car felt suffocating. Camille felt rage building inside her, but also immense sadness at the absurdity of her situation. She had spent years championing justice, yet here she was, on the other side, treated like a criminal for no reason. The car moved in silence, the crackle of the police radio breaking the void, as Camille watched the world go by, her eyes focused on the landscape, but her mind in turmoil. At the station, the booking process was humiliating and dehumanizing. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a cold cell under the incessantly buzzing fluorescent light. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers sneered as the cell door slammed shut. Camille sat on the edge of the cell's bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She replayed the moments in the park, trying to understand how a simple rest could have escalated into something so absurd. But the answer was there, as clear as it was bitter: prejudice. Hours later, a young figure approached with a clipboard. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of a peace officer," he said impersonally. "On what grounds?" Camille asked, her voice now sharper. "That will be discussed in court," he replied, turning and leaving her once more in silence. With Camille's arrest becoming a widely publicized story, she knew the process wouldn't be easy, but the fight was only just beginning. Finally, after bail was posted, Camille was released. Stepping out of the station, the cold night air hit her hard, a stark contrast to the oppression she'd left behind. She saw Marissa, her colleague and friend, waiting on the pavement. "Are you all right?" Marissa asked, her face etched with worry. Camille nodded, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. "I am," she replied, but the word felt hollow. Then, after a heavy silence, she said finally, "I'm not letting this go, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa gripped the steering wheel, unsure what to say. "What are you thinking?" "I'm done with this," Camille replied firmly. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight, and I will." That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by piles of books and notebooks, working tirelessly to build a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. It was from relentless determination. As the days passed, the community rallied in support. The video of her arrest, shared by the young woman in the park, spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life began sending messages of support, sharing their own stories of injustice. Camille's resolve strengthened with each email, each call, each comment. She wasn't fighting just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, or ignored. And as she prepared for the legal battle, she couldn't have foreseen the moment justice would take an unexpected turn. A few weeks after Camille's arrest, she received a call from her lawyer, who sounded hesitant. "Camille," he began, "I have something to tell you. The case you're bringing against the officers, they've asked for it to be dropped. And there's more. You've been assigned as a judge for one of their trials next month." The irony was immense. Camille, who had prepared to face them in court, was now about to be the judge presiding over their trial. The weight of the situation was indescribable. For a moment, she wondered if she could be impartial. But remembering everything that had happened, the humiliations and injustices, she knew she had a responsibility to fulfill. It wouldn't be a coincidence. It was an opportunity to show what true justice meant. The court was full on the day of the hearing. The case appeared straightforward. An internal investigation into two police officers accused of using excessive force in an unrelated situation. For most, it was just another day in the judicial system. But when Camille entered the room, her black robe flowing behind her, the atmosphere shifted. The two officers, Carter and Daniels, looked at her, their expressions visibly altered. Camille paused, letting the weight of the moment fill the room. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm. "This court is now in session," she said authoritatively, as she settled into the judge's chair. Carter and Daniels were in shock. They tried to whisper to each other, but the weight of the situation unnerved them. Camille observed them for a moment before beginning the proceedings. Her focus was absolute, but with every movement they made, she felt a pang of something profound. She wasn't seeking revenge, but justice. As the trial progressed, Camille maintained her impartial stance. She took notes, asked questions, and ensured the process was just. During the testimonies, she could see the officers shrink. The look on Carter's face, a mixture of remorse, was a reflection of what was to come. By the end of the trial, the decision was clear. The evidence against the officers was overwhelming. Their behavior wasn't just a misjudgment, it was abuse of authority. Camille didn't let the weight of the situation overwhelm her. She performed her duty with determination, delivering a fair judgment that included suspension, retraining, and a disciplinary record for both officers. The trial concluded with the sound of the gavel. As the room emptied, Camille sat, reflecting on what had transpired. She knew this victory was only the beginning. Real change was yet to come, and she would be a part of it, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who believed in the power of accountability and action. Leaving the courthouse, she observed a group of young activists gathering for a peaceful protest. In those moments, she felt that the fight for justice wasn't over, but that, with everyone's support, progress was possible. This was the justice she wanted and would always fight for. The days following the trial were intense. Camille felt increasing pressure, not only because of the repercussions of her role as judge, but also because she knew her fight didn't end there. The court decision was a landmark, but the real battle lay in transforming the system and changing the mindset of people who still saw justice as a process that favored only a few. She didn't want her name to become a symbol of individual resistance. She wanted the cause she was fighting for to be the true legacy. And as the weeks passed, conversations about police reform began to gain momentum. Camille knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but the movement was growing, and she had a clear vision of where to focus her energy. Meanwhile, on days Camille wasn't in court, she dedicated herself to helping organize demonstrations, lectures, and community discussions. The support of the local population was vital fuel for her movement. She used her legal expertise to engage directly with the authorities, challenging established norms, demanding answers, and highlighting issues that had always been neglected. For her, the fight wasn't just against the officers who had arrested her, but against a system that allowed this kind of abuse without question. Camille participated in more than one public meeting during those weeks, always with the same conviction. She was no longer just defending one person's case, but the cause of all the oppressed, of those who had no voice in the system. Her speech became more fervent, her words more sharply directed at local politicians, the security forces and society in general, which seemed so accustomed to turning a blind eye to systemic racism. At one meeting, during an event at a community center, Camille met a young man named Ethan who had been a victim of police abuse in the same neighborhood. He was there to tell his story and seek justice for those like him. Hearing his account, Camille felt even more determined to continue the fight. Ethan had been brutally approached by police during a traffic stop, thrown to the ground for no reason, much like what she had experienced. But what truly touched Camille was the way he spoke about the situation. He wasn't asking for revenge, but simply that those responsible for the abuse be held accountable. He wanted other people to have the opportunity to live without fear of the police, as any citizen should. The movement was growing, but so was the resistance. The pressure on Camille increased, and she knew the coming weeks would be crucial to ensuring that the progress made could be consolidated. Even with public support and the strength of her case, she couldn't ignore the enormous machine she was challenging. The political, economic, and institutional power behind police violence was immense, but Camille never hesitated. Her faith in justice was unwavering. Marissa's support was crucial during this period. She knew her friend was consuming herself in the fight, sometimes forgetting to look after herself. One evening, after a long day at the office, Marissa brought food and sat with Camille at the table. The two talked for hours, reminiscing about their law school days and how they had fallen in love with the idea of upholding justice, but never imagining they would be dealing with a case like this one. "Camille, you need to rest. You're putting yourself in a very difficult position. The pressure is immense and you know it. I understand this is a very important cause, but you won't be able to change the world without taking care of yourself first." Camille, for a moment, seemed fragile. She knew Marissa was right, but the feeling of being at the center of a fight much bigger than herself propelled her forward. "I know, Marissa, but there are times when it seems that if we don't raise this flag, it will never be raised. What happened to me could happen to anyone. I can't simply ignore it. I know I'll end up sacrificing myself, but this is something I can't let pass." Marissa sighed and looked at Camille with an expression of concern, but also of support. She knew her friend was doing the right thing, but couldn't help but fear how much this burden was affecting her mental and emotional health. The fight seemed endless, and as the movement for justice gained more strength, Camille received an unexpected proposal. A group of local lawyers and social activists invited her to participate in a national panel on police reform, to be held in Washington, D.C. It was a unique opportunity to talk about her case, but also to discuss public policies that could combat police violence and institutionalized racism. She knew this would be a chance to spread her message further than she could ever achieve alone. Camille accepted the invitation and, together with Marissa, traveled to Washington. The event was a transformative experience. Camille had the chance to share her story before hundreds of people, including other victims of police misconduct. In speaking, she didn't just recount the facts, but also exposed systemic failures, the injustices that occurred systematically, and how these issues intertwined with broader social and economic dynamics. She became an advocate for legislative reforms aimed at greater transparency in policing, the creation of adequate training programs for officers, and the promotion of a culture of respect for civil rights. It was an emotional experience, marked by tears from people who heard Camille's story and saw themselves reflected in it. She felt stronger and more committed than ever. The fight wouldn't be easy, but she was surrounded by people who shared the same vision, and this motivated her even more. Returning to Fort Collins, Camille realized the impact of her participation in the panel had been significant. The discussion around police reform intensified in the city, and she was invited to more meetings, more roundtables, and even meetings with local authorities. She was becoming an active voice in her community, not only because of her personal experience, but also because of her in-depth knowledge of the legal system and her ability to articulate concrete solutions. At that moment, Camille knew that, despite the difficulties and struggles still to come, she was on the right path. And more importantly, she was no longer alone. There were thousands of people who were now joining her in the fight for real change. She wasn't just advocating for a cause anymore, she was leading a movement. And that, in itself, was a victory. As the months passed, the political pressure on the justice system began to increase. Camille continued to work with her team of lawyers, reviewing cases of abuse and helping to structure new processes. She became a tireless advocate, and with each victory, each reform that passed, she felt she was building something lasting, something that would give voice to the voiceless. But deep down, she knew the system would never be perfect. There would always be more battles to be fought. However, with each step towards justice, Camille felt she was fulfilling her mission. The future was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it, because now, more than ever, she believed that change was within reach of all those willing to fight for it. The sound of activists marching echoed in her memories as Camille observed the city. The demonstrations, the discussions, and the reforms were only just beginning. And she, once again, was at the center of it all, not as a simple victim, but as a leader, ready to build a fairer future for everyone. The fight for justice, she knew, would never end. But it was a fight worth fighting. The movement for justice continued to grow exponentially. Camille no longer saw herself as the woman who had been unjustly arrested in the park, but as the leader of a movement that crossed borders and reached people across the country. Her speeches became increasingly frequent, and her actions in and out of court were beginning to create a profound impact on the community. She felt the responsibility of being a voice for those who still couldn't be heard, and this motivated her to keep going, even when the pressure seemed unbearable. The support of Marissa, her safe haven, was vital. She was always by Camille's side, offering not only friendship, but also the insight that was sometimes lacking when Camille's mind became clouded by the intensity of the challenges. Marissa knew that Camille's focus was on something bigger, but she also knew that her friend's health needed to be preserved. Thus, she encouraged her to seek moments of pause, of rest, although Camille was reluctant to interrupt what she saw as her mission. In one of these forced pauses, Camille went to a therapy session, something she had been putting off for months. The psychologist who attended to her, a woman of calm appearance and sharp listening skills, began to explore Camille's emotions, those she had refused to deal with directly. Although it was difficult for Camille to admit, she was overwhelmed. The pressure of the daily struggle was beginning to weigh more heavily than she cared to acknowledge. But there was also an immense strength within her, something that kept her firm, something that came from a deep place of pain, but also of hope. "Do you feel that this struggle is your mission?" the psychologist asked, observing Camille attentively. Camille thought for a moment before answering, her gaze distant. "I feel it is. I feel that if I don't fight, no one will. If we don't stand up now, everything that happened, all the suffering, will continue." The psychologist nodded, understanding the magnitude of Camille's words. "But you also need to understand that the fight cannot be yours alone. You need to let others carry it with you. This responsibility doesn't need to be yours alone." The words resonated in Camille's mind, but she didn't want to admit that she was afraid to rely on others. And yet, she knew that the solitude of the struggle was wearing her down, that she couldn't continue alone. She needed to learn to delegate, to trust those who were by her side. While Camille reflected on what she had discussed in therapy, Marissa became increasingly involved in the movement. She knew that her friend needed more than emotional support. She needed people who were willing to fight alongside her on all levels. Marissa began to help organize protests, actions to raise awareness, and, most importantly, to strengthen the legal basis that underpinned the movement. Camille's journey was transforming. She was no longer just a lawyer defending just causes. She was now a symbol of resistance, a voice that echoed on every street corner of the country. But she knew that for the changes to consolidate, more than just individual action was needed. Collective mobilization was required, a support network that transcended her own experience. And so she began to ally herself with other public figures, other lawyers, activists, and groups fighting for the same causes. A coalition was formed, composed of people from different spheres of society, but with a single objective: the transformation of the justice system. The discussions were intense and often painful, but also extremely productive. The voices of all those involved intertwined, creating a collective discourse that could not be ignored. The movement that Camille helped to lead was not limited to combating police brutality, but also involved other systemic issues, such as structural racism, lack of access to quality education, disparity in the treatment of minorities within the judicial system, and the urgent need for legislative reforms. Camille was determined to go further, to transform the individual struggle into a broad and comprehensive movement. She wanted not only to correct the wrongs committed against her, but also to create a fairer system for everyone. There were times when fatigue threatened to take over. The struggle was arduous and the results often seemed small in the face of the magnitude of what needed to be changed. But then Camille remembered what motivated her. She remembered the faces of everyone who, like her, had been victims of abuse and injustice. She remembered the people who came to her in the streets, at events, on social media, saying, "Thank you for speaking for us." Those moments were the fuel that kept her going, that made her realize she wasn't alone. With each achievement, Camille felt she was planting seeds for the future. She didn't care about the speed of change. The important thing was that it was happening. The system was being challenged in ways it never had been before. Public pressure was immense, and the authorities began to realize that the narrative was shifting. More and more people were standing up and saying it was time to act. Community support was essential. The city of Fort Collins, where Camille lived, began to become an example of resistance and change. When the police tried to use aggressive tactics during a protest, the population united, forming a protective cordon around the peaceful demonstrators. It was a clear demonstration that community unity could generate the impact that individuals could not achieve alone. Camille knew the challenges would be constant. The fight against such an entrenched system wouldn't happen in months or years, but she was more determined than ever. And with the support of the coalition she helped to form, she knew the impact could be transformative. It was only the beginning. But the path ahead was paved with action, solidarity, and a tireless pursuit of justice. As Camille continued her journey, the scrutiny on society increased. She knew that alongside others, she was forging a new reality, a new understanding of what justice meant. It was a reality where equity wasn't just an empty word, but a daily practice. And that was the world Camille wanted to build, a world where everyone, regardless of their color, origin, or social class, had their rights respected and guaranteed. The movement was growing, but Camille knew the work would never be finished. There would always be something more to do, someone to help, a new injustice to fight. But she was ready. She knew that with the support of those beside her and with the people around her, she could face any challenge that arose. And so, looking to the horizon, Camille felt a renewed hope. The future was still uncertain, but she knew what she was doing was important. The fight for justice, she realized, was a constant journey. And even when the shadows loomed, there was enough light to illuminate the path. It wasn't a definitive victory, but the achievement of something much greater. The promise that justice would one day be true for all. The following weeks brought more challenges, but also more victories. Camille found herself at the center of a growing movement, where her personal struggle now reflected the collective actions of thousands of people who were uniting around her. Each protest, each demonstration, was a reminder that the work was only just beginning. The justice system, as she had always known, wouldn't change overnight, but Camille wasn't prepared to wait passively. She would continue to push, to question, to challenge. With Marissa's support, she began to engage more directly in initiatives aimed at reforming state laws. The movement for police reform, which initially seemed a distant goal, was now gaining momentum. Camille used her position not only to criticize, but also to present practical solutions. Legislative change, however difficult, seemed increasingly possible, especially with the popular support that was growing stronger every day. She also dedicated herself to working with other lawyers, organizing seminars and training to educate community members about their rights. Camille believed that empowering the population was one of the most powerful weapons against the oppressive system. For her, true change would come when people, especially those who had been historically marginalized, felt empowered to fight for their own causes. With each new proposed reform debated in city halls or courts, Camille felt the pressure mounting. But, at the same time, she saw the results of her efforts. One by one, those responsible for police violence were being held accountable, not only for their actions, but also for the impact their attitudes had on the community. Camille knew that justice wasn't easily found, but she was seeing the seeds of change grow before her eyes. The relationship with Marissa, which had begun as a friendship based on emotional support, had transformed into a strong and resilient working partnership. Both were at the center of a silent revolution, moving the gears of a seemingly intransigent system. Marissa, although less visible in the public eye, played a crucial role behind the scenes. She helped structure the communication strategy, negotiate with other activist groups, and keep the legal team united. Camille knew that without her, the media pressure and constant demands for immediate answers would be even harder to bear. The movement's impact was felt not only in Fort Collins, but in neighboring cities and even other parts of the country. Other lawyers began to reach out, offering their support and expertise. Civil rights organizations and NGOs dedicated to police reform began to adopt Camille's cause, expanding the support network she had already established. Camille, with her tireless work, became a reference point, a central voice not only in the fight against police violence, but in all matters involving social justice. What began as a solitary journey was now becoming a united front for justice and equality. However, with each victory there was a battle to be fought. While public opinion was largely on her side, the political and economic forces that underpinned the system found themselves increasingly pressured to respond. Camille knew that true change wouldn't come without resistance. She had already faced veiled threats, attempts to discredit her work, and even smear campaigns. But none of this stopped her. She knew the fight was bigger than herself, and it was during one of these moments of intense political confrontation that Camille received a call that would change everything. A prominent state legislator known for his conservative stance and frequently aligned with police forces had decided to support a bill aimed at creating a more transparent system for monitoring police actions. Camille knew he would never support something so radical without some kind of pressure, but now she had the opportunity to finally collaborate with those who could help implement reforms from within the system. She met with him in a closed room, where negotiations began tensely. She knew that any concessions could compromise the essence of her proposals, but she also knew she needed to be strategic. After hours of discussion, with both sides firmly holding their ground, they reached an agreement. The legislator agreed to commit to a proposal that mandated the use of body cameras on all police officers and a review of the recruitment and training practices of the security forces. Although Camille knew there was still much to be done, this agreement represented a significant victory. Police reform was becoming a reality, and she had been instrumental in making it so. The pressure she had faced, the pain of every moment of uncertainty, was beginning to transform into something larger. She was no longer just a lawyer, she was a leader shaping the future of justice in the country. Still, the weight of responsibility didn't lessen. Camille knew that, while she was seeing progress, the path was far from complete. Abuses still happened, inequalities still persisted. The fight against systemic racism, against abuse of power, against the failings of the justice system, continued. But now she felt there was, indeed, a growing movement, a support network formed by people who, like her, were willing to fight for what was right. Over the months, Camille was recognized for her courage and leadership. She received civil rights awards, was invited to speak at international conferences, and became an inspiration to many. But for her, the greatest reward was yet to come, real change in how society viewed and treated black and marginalized people. With each new law passed, each case of abuse of power punished, she knew she was taking another step towards that future. And she also knew this fight would have no end, but that she would be there, always ready to move forward, always ready to be the voice of those who still needed to be heard. The movement expanded to other states, and Camille, now with a strong team by her side, became a national leader in the fight against social injustice. She knew she would still face challenges, that not everyone would be willing to follow the same path of reform. But she also knew that the strength of the movement was greater than any resistance that might arise. The feeling that she was creating something lasting, something that could benefit future generations, kept her motivated. Camille believed in the power of the collective, in the strength of people united in a common cause. The movement no longer depended solely on her. It had taken on a life of its own, and although she continued to lead it with courage and determination, she knew it was only the beginning. Over time, the changes began to be reflected at all levels. New leaders emerged within the movement, and the pressure on the justice system and the police force did not lessen. Camille observed all this with a mixed feeling of pride and weariness. She knew that transformation was a long and often painful process, but she also knew that victory was, indeed, within reach. And so, with the weight of responsibility on her heart, but also with the certainty that she was building something bigger than herself, Camille pressed on. The path was still long, but finally she felt that true justice was beginning to take shape, and she, with everyone beside her, was ready to continue the fight. Camille never imagined that the weight of her mission would be so great, but as the movement grew, she realized that every victory, however small, had a profound meaning. The system was being challenged relentlessly, and society was beginning to realize that justice wasn't something passively received. It was earned through hard work, collective action, courage, and often personal sacrifice. Despite legislative victories and achievements within the justice system, Camille knew the fight wouldn't end with a simple change in law or a victorious trial. Systemic racism, police brutality, and inequity were still so deeply ingrained that simply creating new policies wouldn't suffice. The changes needed to be profound and permanent, and that meant educating, raising awareness, and more than anything, continuing to challenge the status quo. The pressure on Camille never lessened. She had been the visible face of a movement that could not fail. Every public speech, every interview, every action in her professional and personal life was observed and analyzed. But over time, Camille learned to cope. She learned to separate the weight of responsibility from her humanity, to take steps forward, even on days when she felt she could go no further. Marissa, once again, was the rock on which she leaned. Over time, the two became inseparable, both personally and professionally. Marissa helped maintain the structure of the movement, while Camille continued to drive the reforms with her unwavering presence and her ability to articulate concrete solutions to complex issues. Together, they became a force that could not be ignored, and the movement only gained strength with the constant support of so many people who joined them. But beyond the fight for civil rights and against police brutality, something else began to weigh more heavily on Camille. The pursuit of justice was not something she could do alone. She realized that her strength lay in collectivity, in the engagement of people who shared the same vision of a more just world. As the months passed, she began to delegate more responsibilities, allowing new leaders to emerge within the movement. This was not just a strategy to lighten her load, but also a recognition that the changes she sought demanded a strong and diverse network of people willing to engage and fight. As the movement expanded, Camille began to notice the effects her fight was having on younger generations. She received letters and messages from teenagers and young adults who, inspired by her journey, were beginning to actively engage in social causes. It was an indescribable feeling to see people who had never met her, who had never been in the streets with her, standing up and defending the same cause. Camille knew that although she was a central figure, the movement had already taken on a life of its own, and that was the true triumph. The Fort Collins community, where it all began, became an example for other cities around the country. The local police, although still under constant scrutiny, were forced to adapt. New protocols were introduced, and the police began training their officers to deal more effectively with issues of racism and prejudice. Of course, not everything was perfect, but there was a growing awareness that change was not only necessary, but inevitable. The local population began to see Camille not just as a lawyer, but as a true human rights advocate. In her final actions as a lawyer and activist, Camille focused her efforts on one of the most pressing issues: the creation of an independent national commission to investigate allegations of police abuse. She knew that only with the transparency and impartiality of investigations could there be true accountability, and the commission would become a beacon of hope for many who, like her, had been victims of the brutality of the system. Her work in creating this commission was arduous, but with the support of allies at all levels of government and society, she finally managed to get the proposal approved. The impact of her victory was felt across the country. As the Commission began to investigate cases of abuse and misconduct, Camille had the opportunity to reflect on her journey. She remembered the long nights, the exhausting discussions, the hours of tireless work, but also the moments of joy and the feeling that finally she was contributing to something that would make a difference. It had been a difficult journey, but she knew that the world was, little by little, transforming. Marissa, who had always been by her side, finally suggested that Camille start thinking about her own personal life. It was difficult for her, as always, to divide her attention between work and life outside of it. But at that moment, she knew the time had come to seek a balance. She wouldn't need to abandon her fight, but perhaps it was possible to live with a little more lightness, to seek moments of peace, and above all, to allow herself to look to the future with more hope. The movement Camille had started was no longer focused solely on her. It had grown, diversified, spread across the country, and with it, the idea that justice could be more than a distant ideal. She believed that true change was made of small, everyday actions, of each person who rose up to fight for a fairer world, for a future where the next generations wouldn't have to face the same injustices. Camille, with all the sacrifices made along the journey, knew the work wasn't complete. But she also knew that the seeds she had planted were sprouting. She could finally look back and see the concrete changes that had happened. The system still had its flaws, but social consciousness had shifted, and the fight for justice was no longer an isolated battle, but a movement of everyone. The vision of a better future seemed closer now, and Camille knew that, with everyone's support, she would continue to work to ensure that this future was not only possible, but real. What she had started, along with those who believed in the power of change, had no end. And so, with a heart full of hope and determination, Camille moved forward, knowing that justice was not a destination, but a journey worth taking every day.